Hello, I'm Cliff Sarantine, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Wildwood Ways, Edible and Medicinal Treasures. Today we're going to take a look at the wild rose. Wild rose is a ubiquitous feature in any temperate to boreal region in North America. It is also a very valuable wild forageable. Related to the apple, wild rose is hardy, widespread, survives in open, windswept areas, as well as sheltered glades and meadows. Like the domestic rose, the blossoms and the fruit, known as rose hips, are edible. It is a tradition in France to eat the petals of domestic roses, and wild roses are quite nice also. As a rule, the darker the coloration, the more flavorful the rose petals. White petals have a light, delicate flavor. Pink and lavender petals have a medium flavor, and dark red petals have a strong flavor, perhaps a bit bitter. Wild rose petals make an excellent addition to herbal and black teas, and they are a wonderful garnish on salads. Often we garnish our salads with rose petals, whether we're using lettuce from our gardens, or dandelion leaves, or any other source for greens. Roses of all kinds are also useful in the making of scents. They may be dried and compacted into incense, or their essence may be leached out and made into a perfume. Dried rose petals often form a staple of potpourris. Yet the real treasure among wild roses, in my opinion, are the rose hips. It is little known and little appreciated what a gift rose hips are. If there is wild rose or domestic rose in your area, no matter how far north you are, you will never suffer scurvy. The rose hips you see in this image are quite large for wild rose hips. They have a lovely flavor, tart and sweet, somewhat like an apple, but also uniquely rose. Rose hips have vastly more vitamin C than oranges. It is commonly known that one entire orange has about a day's worth of vitamin C for your average person. A single rose hip has as much as 10 days worth of vitamin C. Now, the human body cannot make its own vitamin C, so we do need vitamin C every day. One would have to eat a rose hip every day, just like with an orange. But when you consider that this tiny fruit the size of a quarter has up to 10 oranges worth of vitamin C in it, that's quite an accomplishment. Both rose petals and rose hips lend themselves to drying. They can easily be dried out, and both make a wonderful tea. Rose petals give a tea that is reminiscent to me of lavender, a floral taste that is very pleasant in black tea. Rose hips, when dried and then steeped into a tea, taste to me, when a bit of honey is added, like cotton candy. Now, I've been told I have unusual taste buds, and you may not find that to be the case for yourself, but I am sure that you will be delighted with the taste of rose hips. Do be aware that the flavor of rose hips varies from bush to bush and place to place. When we resided in a remote cabin in the Alaskan bush, my wife Daphne and I often harvested rose hips to make teas throughout the winter. We found that it was very reliable in the Alaskan wilderness, that every rose hip was quite pleasant to the taste. Everyone had that sweet, tart, almost appleish taste. Here in Nova Scotia, we often find that wild rose hips have a bland and even somewhat bitter taste. Worse still, the texture could be described as mealy. This is not to say that the rose hips here are bad. They're just as good for you as they are anywhere else. And they are palatable. I wouldn't call them necessarily good, but they are palatable. However, as I said, some bushes are better than others, and if you hunt about, occasionally you'll find bushes that are quite good. This particular thicket of wild roses has excellent rose hips, and we've been harvesting from this little patch for years. I find that the quality and texture of the rose hips will be strongly indicated by their size and color. Rose hips that are plump and glossy red and about the diameter of a quarter are more likely to have a pleasant taste and texture. These rose hips are a joy to eat raw, and often we will snack on them on the trail. We came by here a couple of weeks ago and gathered several buckets of them to bring home to dry for the winter. Needless to say, at our homestead, we don't need to rely on southern oranges for our source of vitamin C. Be aware that rose hips are full of seeds. They are a thin sphere of flesh surrounding many, many seeds. Because of this, you'll probably need to harvest more than you think you do to get enough to get you through the winter season. You can anticipate that roughly 10% of the mass of the rose hips that you harvest will be actual usable fruit. The rest will be seeds. However, this is not to say that you actually need to open up the rose hips and discard the seeds. You can still dry them and use them for tea as they are. My favorite way to prepare rose hips for tea is to first dry them and then to lightly pound them with a mallet, just enough to crack them and break the surface so that when they go into hot water, they can steep easily. I might add the rose hips to hot water by themselves for a strongly rose flavored tea. I really love to blend rose hips with rose petals for a very interesting floral and fragrant tea. I also love on a fine winter morning a hot cup of wild rose black tea, which is simply a black tea with dried rose petals added to it. Just be aware when harvesting wild roses that they are covered with sharp thorns, just like their wild cousins. Though, where domesticated roses tend to have a few very stiff, large thorns, wild roses tend to have many smaller, finer thorns. In this sense, they are safer, they're not as likely to prick you badly, but on the other hand, they are peskier because they are everywhere. All in all, the wild rose is an excellent forageable. Ubiquitous, it is easily harvested, can be used in many ways fresh, and can be dried to keep all through till the next harvest. In fact, wild rose keeps so readily that it will often dry right on the bush and keep without any intervention right through spring. A person in need can go out at most times from late summer all the way through spring when the snow first begins to melt and gather a crop of rose hips dried right off the bush. I wish you could smell the fragrance of this rose bush. Even this late into the season with only a few wild rose blossoms still on the bush, it has a distinct rose smell. I also find that rosy smell is a strong indicator of the quality of the flavor of both the roses and the rose hips. The rosier it smells, the stronger will be the flavor and the less likely that you'll find the rose hips to be bitter or mealy. Thank you for having joined me for another episode of Wildwood Ways, Edible and Medicinal Treasures. Keep watching for more episodes on the wild foods and medicines to be found out of doors. Go soft, go gently, and leave no trace. Let's go home, boy.